The structure rising behind Gaspard Marchand's cabin looked like a half-buried basket. In the granite quarry hamlet of the Northeast Kingdom, where men thought in straight lines and right angles, it was an object of profound suspicion. While every other settler in the valley was fitting heavy timbers and chinking their walls tighter against the coming winter of 1858, Gaspard was weaving willow branches. He wove them between the studs of his cabin's frame, creating a dense, springy lattice that left the wall hollow. At the timesheet bench where quarry seniority determined a man's place, the judgment was swift and certain. Master Cutter Jessup, a man who could split a 2-ton block of granite with a perfectly placed tap, called it a Cooper's folly. "He's building a barrel, not a house," Jessup said, his words carrying the weight of unquestioned competence. "That green willow will shrink. The first hard frost will split his clay from top to bottom. He'll be living in a sieve by March." The other men nodded. They'd all seen the failed plaster kitchen in Lyndonville. The story was a cautionary tale told to new arrivals. This was the same mistake, just made with twigs instead of proper lath. Gaspard heard the talk. He saw the way the men looked at his work, their gazes a mixture of pity and contempt. But he said nothing. He just continued his slow, methodical work, packing the woven lattice with a thick daub of clay and straw, building a wall that held a secret only he and his mother understood. The secret wasn't about strength or permanence in the way the quarrymen understood it. It was about a different kind of survival, a truth learned not in the hard certainty of stone, but in the pliable, forgiving wisdom of wood. The question hung in the cold autumn air, unspoken but sharp as a shard of granite. Why would a man build a house that was meant to breathe, when everyone knew the only way to survive a Vermont winter was to build a tomb and seal yourself inside? The answer to that question is a lesson in the hidden physics of warmth, a story of how forgotten knowledge can transform a life. If you stay with us, you will learn precisely how a basket weave wall can defeat a windless 40 below frost, and why the most powerful innovations often come from those who remember what everyone else has chosen to forget. I promise you will see how a simple geranium became the most eloquent scientific instrument in the entire state of Vermont. To follow this story of quiet genius, consider subscribing to our channel and liking this video. And tell us in the comments, what's the most unconventional building method you've ever seen? Gaspard Marchand was not a quarryman. He was not a farmer, nor was he a frontiersman in the way the men of the hamlet understood the term. He was a cooper, born and raised in Orleans County, and his hands knew the language of steam-bent wood. For 14 years, his world had been one of oak staves, iron hoops, willow withies, and the sharp, clean scent of the steaming box. He understood the precise moment a strip of willow, subjected to heat and moisture, would yield its rigidity and accept a new shape without breaking. He knew its memory, its tendency to spring back, and how to use that tension to bind a barrel so tightly it could hold water, cider, or spirits without weeping a single drop. His right forearm carried the map of a mistake made long ago, a puckered, glossy scar from a blast of steam that he instinctively covered by pulling his sleeve down whenever he entered another man's home. He had not come to the quarry to split stone, but to follow his mother, Celestine. At 71, her world had contracted to what her hands could touch and what her ears could hear. Her eyes, clouded by cataracts, could distinguish light from dark, a window from a wall, but little else. They had moved here after the cooperage was sold, seeking the small pension offered to the widows of men who had supplied barrels to the quarry for its black powder. They had a small cabin, a standard single-wall construction of rough-sawn plank over a timber frame, and in their first winter, it had nearly broken them. That winter was a lesson in failure. By 4 in the afternoon, intricate patterns of frost, like ghostly ferns, would bloom across the inside of the pantry door. Gaspard would watch his mother's hands fumble with her knitting needles, her fingers grown too stiff and cold to grip the yarn long before supper was even on the stove. The whale oil in the lamp would sludge thick, the flames sputtering low and weak. They burned through 2 full cords of seasoned maple before the Christmas snows arrived, a pace that would leave them destitute or frozen by February. Every night Gaspard would lie awake, listening to the cabin shrink and groan in the cold, feeling the chill radiate from the walls as if they were made of ice. The stove roared, consuming wood with a furious appetite, but its heat never reached the corners of the room. It was a dry, aggressive heat that scorched your face while your back remained frozen. This was the problem he had to solve. It was not an abstraction. It was the chill in his mother's bones. His knowledge source was not a book or an engineer's diagram. It was Celestine herself. She carried the memory of the fire of 1839, a blaze that had consumed their old byre and nearly taken the Holstein cow with it. With Gaspard's father busy at the cooperage, Celestine, then a woman in her prime, had rebuilt the cowshed herself. She had used what was plentiful and cheap, willow from the riverbank and clay from the pit behind the house. She had woven a basket wall inside the new frame and packed it with a daub of clay and chaff, just as her own mother had done in Beau Sud. That simple repair, a mother's practical solution to a crisis, had kept the Holstein alive and well through 6 Vermont winters, its breath steaming gently in a space that held a soft, even warmth the main house could never match. Gaspard had been a boy, but he remembered. He remembered the feel of the air in the byre, the absence of drafts, the quiet contentment of the animal. Now, decades later, the memory returned as a solution. As Celestine's sight failed, her other senses grew sharper. She could no longer see the frost on the walls, but she could feel its presence with an unnerving accuracy. The cold was a physical weight, a pressure that stole the strength from her limbs. Her failing eyes were why the walls had to do what the stove could not. Gaspard was not just building a warmer house. He was building a sensory refuge for his mother, a place where the world, for her, would be defined not by what she couldn't see, but by the constant, gentle warmth she could feel. She would sit by the new wall as he worked, her hands, gnarled but certain, sorting the harvested willow withies. "This one has the good bend," she would murmur, passing him a supple rod she had identified by weight and texture alone. He was building her eyes a wall they could read. The failure of the conventional cabin was a puzzle of physics that every man in the hamlet fought, but none truly understood. They saw the enemy as the draft. Their solution was to seal every gap, to chink and caulk and stuff every crack with moss and mud, until their homes were as airtight as they could make them. They built massive stone fireplaces and installed cast-iron stoves that glowed cherry red, believing that if they could just pour enough heat into the box, it would eventually overwhelm the cold. They were half right. The drafts were a problem. But they were only a symptom of a much larger, invisible engine of cold operating inside their walls. The standard cabin in the quarry hamlet was a timber frame with vertical studs, sheathed on the outside with planking, and on the inside with wood paneling or nothing at all. This created a hollow space within the wall, typically 4 to 6 inches deep. To the settlers, this empty space seemed like a good thing, a barrier of air between them and the outside. They thought of it as a buffer. What they failed to grasp was that the air inside that cavity did not stay still. It was in constant, furious motion. The process was simple and relentless. The air touching the cold outer sheathing would chill, become denser, and sink. As it reached the bottom of the wall cavity, it would push across to the warmer inner wall, where it would absorb heat from the room. Now warmer and less dense, this air would rise up the inner side of the cavity until it reached the top, where it would be drawn back to the cold outer sheathing to release its stolen heat and begin the cycle anew. This was a convective loop, a silent, invisible conveyor belt inside the walls, constantly stealing warmth from the living space and dumping it into the frozen outdoors. The more they stoked their stoves, the faster the conveyor belt ran. A hotter inner wall only accelerated the cycle of heat transfer. A man could burn 12 cords of wood from November to March and still find his water bucket frozen solid 6 feet from the stove. The heat they produced was measured in British thermal units, or BTUs. A pound of dry maple contained about 7,000 BTUs of potential heat. But for every 1,000 BTUs they released into the room, the convective loops in their walls might be carrying 300 of them away before they could ever warm the opposite corner. They were trying to fill a bucket with a massive hole in the bottom. Gaspard saw this firsthand in the cabins of his neighbors. He saw it in the home of the teamster, Arden, whose wife complained that the floor was so cold it felt like walking on a frozen river. He saw it in the meticulously constructed house of the master cutter, Jessup, a man whose joinery was flawless, yet whose parlor curtains would sway gently on the calmest nights, moved by the currents of cold air descending from the walls. These men were masters of their craft, but they were fighting the wrong enemy. They were fighting gaps they could see, while Gaspard intended to fight the motion they could not. His solution was not to make the wall more solid, but to fill its emptiness with something that would stop the air from moving. In late August, when the sun still held its strength but the nights carried the first hint of a chill, Gaspard began his work. He went down to the river, to the thickets of willow that grew wild and dense along the banks. With a sharp billhook, he cut hundreds of young straight shoots, or withies, ranging from the thickness of a thumb to that of a little finger. He chose them for their pliability, testing each one with a quick bend. He bundled them by size and carried them back to the cabin, where Celestine sat on a stool in the sun, her nearly blind eyes turned toward the sound of his approach. He stripped the interior walls of the cabin down to the bare studs, exposing the hollow 4-inch cavity that was the source of all their winter misery. The other quarrymen, passing on their way home, would stop and watch, shaking their heads. Tearing his house apart with winter coming, one muttered to another, "The man's gone mad." Gaspard ignored them. He began at a corner, taking the thickest withies and setting them horizontally between the studs, wedging them tightly. Then he began to weave. With the rhythmic, practiced motions of a cooper tightening a hoop, he wove the thinner, more flexible withies vertically through the horizontal rods. He worked from the floor up, creating a dense, cross-hatched web that filled the entire stud bay. It was strong, but not rigid. It had a spring to it, a give and take that stone and heavy timber did not possess. The construction signature moment came one afternoon in mid-September. The air had turned crisp, and the maple trees on the ridge were beginning to blush with color. Gaspard had a kettle simmering over a small fire just outside the cabin door. He took a particularly stubborn withy, one that resisted the initial bend, and held it in the plume of steam. As he worked, he unconsciously turned his right arm so the puckered scar on his forearm was facing away from the path, a small, private gesture of a man long accustomed to hiding a perceived flaw. After a minute in the steam, the wood relaxed. He tested it, bending it 3 ways until he felt its tension yield. It was now ready. As he turned to fit it into the wall, Celestine, who had been listening to the hiss of the kettle and the creak of the wood, held out another rod. "This one is ready without the steam," she said. Her fingers had already assessed its weight, its moisture, its internal willingness to bend. He took it from her, a silent transfer of knowledge between mother and son. At that moment, a young quarry boy, sent on an errand, stopped on the path. He forgot his task entirely, his gaze fixed on the strange and wonderful sight, a man weaving the walls of his house like a giant basket. his blind mother, his silent, all-knowing apprentice. The boy stood there for a full 5 minutes, watching a process so alien to the world of hammers and iron wedges that it felt like magic. Once the willow lattice, or lath, was complete, the second phase began. Gaspard mixed the daub. He used clay from a deposit he'd found near the river, mixing it in a shallow pit with water, sand for binding, and, most importantly, chaff and chopped straw from the last threshing. This fibrous material was critical. It would act as a reinforcement, preventing the clay from cracking as it dried, but it also served a more subtle, crucial purpose. He packed the daub into the willow lath with a wooden trowel, forcing it deep into the weave from the inside of the cabin. He built it up layer by layer, a full 4 inches thick, until it completely filled the stud cavity and was flush with the interior face of the studs. The work was slow, messy, and relentless. He worked from dawn until the light failed, his hands caked in mud, his back aching. The opposition voices grew louder as the first frosts silvered the ground. Jessup, the master cutter, made his pronouncement at the timesheet bench. "I saw a plasterer in Lyndonville try something like that in a summer kitchen. Used green lath. By spring, the wall was a spiderweb of cracks you could slide a shilling into. That willow is full of water. It'll shrink every which way. The clay will fall out in chunks." He wasn't being cruel. He was stating a fact based on his experience. Wood moved. Clay didn't. It was a fool's combination. Arden, the teamster, offered a different warning, leaning against Gaspard's woodpile one evening. "That much wet clay packed against your sills, Gaspard. You're inviting rot. Come spring thaw, that bottom timber will be soft as punk. You're trading a cold winter for a collapsed house." Even the town selectman, a man concerned with order and taxable value, circled the property one Sunday. He didn't speak to Gaspard directly, but his measured pacing and skeptical gaze were a form of official inquiry. A house built of mud and sticks was a liability, an anomaly on the town rolls. To each warning, Gaspard gave a quiet, simple reply. To Jessup, he said, "The weave is the thing." To Arden, he said, "The stove will dry it from the inside out." He offered no lengthy defense, no argument. He let the wall speak for itself. By late October, as the first flakes of snow swirled in the air, the inner shell was complete. He paneled over it with thin pine boards, and the cabin once again looked normal from the inside. But between that paneling and the outer sheathing was a 4-inch thick, monolithic barrier of woven willow and fibrous clay, a silent testament to a cooper's art and a mother's wisdom. What the quarrymen saw as a fragile basket of twigs packed with mud was, in fact, a sophisticated thermal machine. Gaspard's innovation worked by disrupting the fundamental physics of heat loss that plagued every other cabin in the valley. The genius was in the combination of the willow lath and the clay chaff daub, a system that attacked the problem of cold on 2 fronts, convection and conduction. The primary enemy, as we've seen, was the convective loop inside the hollow wall cavity. This silent engine of heat transfer was what made the standard cabins so inefficient. Gaspard's 4-inch thick inner shell of daub and willow completely eliminated this. By filling the entire cavity, he removed the empty space where air could circulate. The air was now trapped in millions of tiny pockets within the fibrous matrix of the clay and chaff. Still air is one of the best insulators known. A bubble of air that cannot move, cannot transfer heat by convection. Gaspard had effectively killed the conveyor belt. The quarryman, who understood the solid, predictable nature of stone, saw the wall's components as weak. Willow was flimsy, clay was just dirt. But together, they formed a system. The woven willow, with a density of around 58 pounds per cubic foot, created a strong, 3-dimensional skeleton. This lattice did more than just hold the clay. It ensured that even if the clay developed microscopic cracks as it cured, there was no direct path for air to move through. The clay chaff daub, in turn, provided the thermal mass and the air-trapping matrix. The countless strands of straw and chaff acted like fibers in a wool sweater, creating a tortuous path for heat and breaking the air into pockets so small that convection became impossible. This system had a measurable efficiency, which we would now quantify with an R value, a measure of thermal resistance. Modern estimates for a wattle and daub system like Gaspard's place its R value at approximately 3.8 per inch. A 4-inch thick wall, therefore, provided an R value of over 15. For comparison, the hollow, uninsulated wall cavity of his neighbors' cabins had an effective R value of less than 4. Gaspard had, in one stroke, quadrupled his wall's resistance to heat loss. But the system did more than just insulate. The sheer mass of the clay, several tons of it packed into the walls, acted as a thermal battery. During the day, as the stove was running, this dense core would slowly absorb and store heat. At night, when the fire died down to coals, the walls would begin to radiate that stored warmth back into the room. This created a gentle, even heat that was the complete opposite of the harsh, direct heat from an iron stove. It eliminated the cold spots and moderated the temperature swings. Celestine could sit in any corner of the room and feel the same soft warmth. The walls themselves had become the heating element. Jessup's fear of the daub cracking was logical, but it missed a key point. The slow, deep curing from the stove's heat, combined with the reinforcing action of the chaff and the springiness of the willow lath, allowed the system to settle into a stable, monolithic whole. It was not a rigid system fighting itself, but a pliable one that had found equilibrium. That winter, the weather did not just turn cold, it became a malevolent presence. In the second week of January, a weather pattern settled over the Champlain Valley that old-timers would speak of for decades. It was a freezing fog. For 9 consecutive days, the temperature never rose above 29 degrees below zero, and at night, it plunged to a merciless minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no wind. The air was perfectly still, thick and heavy, saturated with ice crystals that coated every surface. Fence wires grew to the thickness of a man's thumb with a crystalline crust of rime. The sun was a pale, distant disk, its light too weak to offer any warmth. This was the ultimate test. A windless deep cold is a pure test of a structure's ability to resist conductive heat loss. There were no drafts to blame, no howling gales to excuse a cabin's failure. There was only the relentless, silent drain of heat from warm to cold. The quarry hamlet hunkered down. Smoke poured from every chimney in thick white columns that refused to disperse in the heavy air. The sounds of chopping and splitting wood were constant. Inside the conventional cabins, life became a grim battle for survival. Arden, the teamster's wife, Sarah, later told of how they moved their mattress into the kitchen and hung blankets around the stove, creating a small tent within their house. Even then, a bucket of water left 10 feet from the firebox was solid ice by morning. In Jessup's home, despite his flawless joinery, frost crept inward from the window frames, painting the interior walls with a delicate, deadly sheen of white. He burned through a half-cord of his best birch in 5 days, the stove roaring day and night, yet his children slept in their coats and hats. Every parlor plant along the quarry road, the small symbols of domesticity and hope, blackened and died in the first 2 nights. But in Gaspard Marchand's cabin, something impossible was happening. The small box stove was fed a few logs every few hours, consuming wood at a placid, steady rate. What would amount to 1/3 of a cord for the entire week. The air inside was still and quiet. The temperature held at a steady 54 degrees. It was not hot, but it was a deep, pervasive, and life-sustaining warmth. There was no frost on the windows. There were no cold spots. Celestine sat in her rocking chair, her knitting needles clicking softly, her fingers nimble and warm. She did not need to huddle by the stove. The warmth came from all around her, a gentle radiation from the very walls of the house. The proof of this miracle, the silent witness that would testify to Gaspard's genius, sat on the deep windowsill. It was a single geranium, a cutting Celestine had brought with them from Orleans County, housed in a small clay pot. Through the entire 9-day siege of cold, while the world outside was encased in a tomb of ice, the geranium thrived. Its green leaves were vibrant, and one brilliant red blossom stood open, a defiant speck of summer in the heart of an Arctic winter. The vindication did not come as a sudden revelation, a public apology at the timesheet bench. It came as a series of quiet, disconnected moments, a slow cascade of recognition that rippled through the hamlet without ever converging. On the 4th day of the fog, Sarah Arden, the teamster's wife, came to the Marchand cabin. She was delivering a block of lard Gaspard had purchased, and her real purpose was to check on the old woman and her fool son. She expected to find them wrapped in every blanket they owned, shivering over a dying fire. She knocked, and when Gaspard opened the door, a wave of gentle, even warmth met her, a sensation so alien after 4 days of bitter chill that she physically recoiled for a second. "Just bringing the lard," she said, stepping just inside the doorway. Her eyes took a moment to adjust to the dim interior, and then they fell on the windowsill. She saw the geranium. Its red blossom was a shock of color in the gray world. She stared, her mind struggling to reconcile the sight with the reality she had just left. Her own pot of rosemary, a hardy herb she'd kept alive for 3 years, had blackened and turned to mush on the first night of the fog. She said nothing about the flower. She handed Gaspard the lard, mumbled something about the terrible cold, and left. But as she walked back to her own freezing house, the image of that impossible bloom was burned into her mind. She understood, in a way she could not yet articulate, that she had just witnessed something that defied the known laws of her world. 2 days later, on day 6, Jessup the master cutter had business at the far end of the hamlet. His path took him past Gaspard's cabin. As a man of precision and fact, he had dismissed the stories of the Marchand's comfort as exaggeration. He expected to see the cabin banked high with snow for insulation, the windows sealed with canvas, the usual signs of a desperate fight against the cold. Instead, he saw a house that looked unnervingly normal. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney, no more than from a gentle autumn fire, and then, through the clear glass of the front window, he saw it, the impossible splash of red. Jessup stopped. He was 20 yards away, but the color was unmistakable. A flower, in bloom, at nearly 40 below zero. He, who knew the unyielding truths of stone and steel, was confronted with a fact that his experience could not explain. The green willow had not shrunk. The daub had not split. The house was not a sieve. It was a sanctuary. He stood for a long moment, the cold seeping into his bones, and stared at the evidence of his own fallibility. Then, without a word, he turned and walked on, his pace noticeably slower than before. The final recognition came on the 8th day. The selectman's young daughter, Clara, was sent with a signed paper regarding the quarry's wood allotment. She was a girl of 16, less burdened by the rigid certainties of her father's generation. When Gaspard opened the door, he saw her shivering, her shawl pulled tight around her face. "Come in for a moment and warm yourself," he said, his voice quiet. Clara stepped inside and her eyes went wide. She looked at the stove, which was burning with a low, steady flame. She looked at the walls, which felt solid and warm to the touch. And she looked at the geranium, sitting in its pool of soft light on the sill. She stared at it for so long that Celestine, sensing the girl's stillness, turned her head. "Are you cold, child?" the old woman asked, her voice gentle. The question broke the spell. "No, ma'am," Clara whispered. "It's so warm in here." She delivered the paper and fled, not out of fear, but out of a profound and unsettling awe. She carried back to her father not just a signed document, but a first-hand report of a miracle. The three key voices of opposition, the practical teamster's wife, the expert master cutter, and the representative of civic order, had each separately and silently witnessed the undeniable proof. Their certainties had been broken not by argument, but by a flower. A quiet revolution had taken place, one geranium at a time. The house was warm. The fool was a genius. And nobody said a word about it aloud. News of the warm cabin in the quarry hamlet traveled slowly at first. A piece of winter gossip passed between teamsters and trappers, but a story that good, with a proof that simple, could not be contained. That February, at a grange meeting in a neighboring town, a correspondent for the New England Farmer overheard the tale. A writer with an interest in agricultural improvements and practical engineering, he was deeply skeptical but professionally curious. He made the journey to the hamlet in early March, when the snow was still deep, but the harshest cold had broken. He found Gaspard splitting his spring wood, his pile still remarkably high. The man was quiet, reserved, but willing to explain his work. The correspondent, whose name was Alden, spent 2 days with the Marchands. He measured the walls. He took temperature readings. He inspected the daub for cracks and found none. He listened as Gaspard explained the principle, not in the language of physics, but in the language of a cooper, of tension, pliability, and a sealed vessel. He saw Celestine, comfortable and content in her warm home, and he saw the geranium, which had now put forth a second blossom. Alden understood he had stumbled upon something of profound importance. He went back to his office and wrote not just a story, but a technical account. He published it in the April 1859 Almanac Supplement, a publication read by farmers and homesteaders across the region. He detailed the weaving of the willow lath, gave the precise ratio of clay to sand to chaff, and described the slow curing process. He called it the Marchand thermal shell. The idea spread like seed on fertile ground. It was a solution that used cheap, readily available materials and could be implemented by any homesteader with a strong back and a willingness to defy convention. That summer and autumn, 7 new cabins and additions across 3 Vermont counties were built using Gaspard's method. A cluster of Finnish immigrants in the west of the state, familiar with similar techniques using logs and moss, adopted it with enthusiasm. The Cooper's Folly had become a replicable, documented piece of frontier engineering. It was no longer a fluke. It was a system. The principles Gaspard Marchand harnessed through intuition and memory are now central to modern building science. His willow lath and clay daub shell was, in essence, an early form of fibrous insulation, a precursor to the fiberglass bats and blown-in cellulose we use today. His core insight that stopping air movement within a wall cavity is the key to thermal efficiency is the foundational concept behind every insulated building envelope. The massive heat-storing daub wall is what we now call thermal mass, a strategy used in passive solar design to absorb heat and release it slowly, creating stable, comfortable interior temperatures. He had built a high-performance home, nearly a century before the term was ever invented. The story of Gaspard Marchand is more than a tale of frontier ingenuity. It is a testament to the endurance of knowledge passed down, not in books, but through hands. The technique was born from a mother's desperate repair after the fire of 1839. It was an act of necessity that outlived the crisis that required it, a piece of wisdom stored away in memory for decades. A son, faced with a different crisis, not a sudden fire, but the slow, grinding siege of the cold, retrieved that memory and perfected it, driven by love and a quiet determination to care for the woman who had first taught him. For Celestine, whose world was shaped by touch and sound, the wall was not a visual object. She could not see its texture or the way the light fell across it, but she could read it. She could read its constant, steady warmth with the palm of her hand. She could feel its safety in the absence of drafts on her neck. Every moment of her day was framed by its gentle, radiant presence, a silent reassurance that the cold was defeated, that she was safe, and that her son had built for her not just a house, but a world she could understand. The son built his mother's eyes, a wall they could read. If you found this story of quiet innovation and enduring wisdom valuable, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more tales of forgotten genius. Let us know in the comments what you think was more important, Gaspard's technical skill or the memory passed down from his mother. Thank you for watching. The content of this video is for educational and storytelling purposes only. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, though the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any historical building method today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and engineering regulations. This video does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.